Welcome to the PTI seminar for May. I am very pleased that we are going to have a reprise of the Peebles Memorial Lecture, which took place last month at the Herman B. Wells Library, and also by Dr. Craig Stewart. And Craig has been my mentor for a very long time. I'm very pleased that we're able to have the talk here again at the Cyberinfrastructure building to let a lot of the UITS employees who might not have wanted to make the trek over to the library that day so they have a chance to hear this really great talk. Craig's going to take a look back at where IU has been in computing and cyber infrastructure, assess the value of IU's current implementation of information technology in support of research, scholarship, and creative activity, and suggest strategies for supporting IU's excellence in these areas in the coming years. And he is currently the Executive Director of the Pervasive Technology Institute. Dr. Stewart, take it away.
Robert, thank you so much. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Let me tear right into the talk. And actually, the first few slides I'm going to click right past. We have a diverse audience today from 12 years old to considerably more than 12 years old, and a diversity of backgrounds. So I've got handouts that went out by email with the announcement and which are on your chairs, which have a number of definitions. And I'm not going to read definitions to you. You can look them up if you want. And if you don't need to, you don't have to. But what I'm going to talk about today is sort of where we started at Indiana University in terms of computing in support of research, scholarship, and creative activities. I'm going to talk about 2 decades of really steady progress in service capability and service delivery from what was originally called research and academic computing and is now called research technologies. I'm going to do a little bit of a rewind and recap some of the history and current structure and function of the Pervasive Technology Institute. Then I'm going to do a little bit more of a rewind and talk about where we are in terms of national strategies in information technology and advanced computing, because that plays a lot into where we are in our current environment locally as well as nationally. And then I'm going to talk about how we move forward, and I want to say a little bit about purposes at hand and make a couple disclaimers. So this talk focuses on decades worth of work by hundreds of people. Most of what I'm going to talk about was done by somebody other than me. I am particularly focused on what research technologies and the Pervasive Technology Institute have done, often in collaboration with the School of Informatics, Computing, and Engineering. I'm not going to talk about things that are relevant to networking and research and creative activity. Those weren't my portfolio. There weren't things that I had to do with. And you could do another really, really long talk about all the cool things that have happened as a result of IU's involvement in networking. And last and not least, I want to mention that the groups that I'm going to talk about were formed in their current form largely by Christopher Peebles and led by him for many, many years. So with that, I'm going to tear through 4 slides of definitions and not read them to you. I will come back to one of them later. You've got copies of the definitions you can read if you want. What I really want to do is start talking about where research computing began at Indiana University. And it began in 1949 with a grant from the Office of Naval Research to Indiana University for a mechanical card-based calculator, which turned out to be so important to chemistry and physics research at Indiana University that in 1953, then President Herman B. Wells called for the creation of a research computing center for Indiana University generally. That center was formed forthwith, and in 1955, astronomy professor Marshall Wrubel was named the first director of Indiana University's Research Computing Center. And he was not just an eminent astronomer, he had a real sense for the importance of computing. And one of the things that he did as the first director of the Research Computing Center at IU was establish a principle that we have lived by every day from 1955 to today, That is that the university's computing resources are a common good. They're intended for use by the entire university community, and in particular, Professor Wrubel's view was that IU's electronic computer was as important and should be as accessible to his astronomy graduate students as it was to his faculty colleagues in the business school. He went on to write a paper in 1960 called The Electronic Computer as Astronomical Instrument that really revolutionized observational astronomy at the time. Sadly, he died on sabbatical in 1968, but he really put research computing at IU on a good, solid footing, and clearly bears credit for where we are today in terms of our computing environment and in terms of our physical environment, because we are in the Wrubel Commons in the Cyberinfrastructure building. From that auspicious start, there were intermittent times of real distinction for Indiana University. In 1964, 2 professors of computer science and 1 staff member in the computing center, Steve Young, who in some ways is my organizational great-grandfather, wrote a compiler called FastTran, Fast4Tran 2 compiler for the IBM 709 computers. That was one of the first 10 software programs ever protected by copyright. It was, as a compiler, faster than any compiler ever made by IBM for the 709 computing series. And the 2 computer scientists involved in that project credited Steve Young and his knowledge of the I/O system, the 709, for why the compiler was that fast. Going on, 1968, computer science was formed as a distinct department in the College of Arts and Sciences. 1979, Doug Hofstadter published Gödel, Escher, Bach. This is a photograph of my soft cover copy of Gödel, Escher, Bach. It was an amazing book that revolutionized a lot of thinking about information technology, information science, computing math, and music as well. In the 1980s, many people believed that Ernie Davidson might be on his way to winning a Nobel Prize in chemistry. He developed the Hondo series of analytic chemistry software. IU invested a lot of computing resources in his lab. Unfortunately, another group got a Nobel Prize for work very closely related to what Professor Davidson was doing, so he did not get a Nobel Prize. 1993, IU acquired an Intel Paragon, IU's first parallel supercomputer for general purpose access throughout the university. IU had a couple other parallel computers in individual departments, but the Paragon, which was a brilliant piece of parallel computing engineering, was the first university-wide accessible computing system run by the Computing Center for the general IU community. 1995 and 1996, 2 really historic accomplishments by Dennis Gannon. First, he received a shared university research grant from IBM to get an IBM Sp Supercomputer for Indiana University, and he participated in something called the I-Way, which for 1 week at one conference demonstrated what could be done with a 10 gigabit per second seashore to seashore network link tying together multiple supercomputers in the US. That really was the beginning of what we think of today as modern computing grids. And then, you know, in the 80s and 90s, research computing at IU wasn't distinctive for very much else other than for contributing to a revolving door effect in which bright young professors of physics, astronomy, and chemistry would come to IU. They'd get tenure, and then they would get recruited away to go someplace else with better computing resources than Indiana University had. Then everything changed with Miles Brand as president of university when he recruited Michael McRobbie to come to IU as its first full vice president in information technology. And Miles Brand himself was not particularly and acutely detailed in his understanding of information technology, but he understood the strategic value of IT from the university standpoint. So he set this goal for IU to be a leader in absolute term in use and application of information technology among American universities. This was such a ridiculous goal at the time it was set that that people working for the computing center couldn't suppress their giggles at meetings. It was just outlandish to think of IU being that way. And yet, in 1997, Vice President McRobbie led a reorganization of the IT organizations at IU to create what is now University Information Technology Services. We created an information technology strategic plan for the university. Copy of the cover is right there. And what was really important about that plan was that it was an IT plan for the university, not a strategic plan for the IT organization. It covered the entire university, all of its activities and enterprises. And the summary of this plan is get the technology stacks right. No busy signals on modems, get networks right, get administrative systems right, and invest heavily in research computing. And in 1996 and 1997, President McRobbie got engaged in a grant that was just in the process of being awarded to Indiana University called SCAMP, Scalable Array of something multiprocessors. And the original grant award from the NSF was going to buy a supercomputer and one visualization environment. And Michael McRobbie said, no, we're going to add some money to that, and we're going to make this really important. So what we got out of SCAMP was a 64 processor Origin 2000, the first Origin 2000 owned by any individual university in the US. There were other universities that had Origin 2000s as part of federal facilities, but we were the first university to own our own. And then we built this thing called a cave, which is a 10-foot cube immersive stereoscopic visualization environment that makes you feel like you're standing inside a virtual world. And we got this thing called an Immersidesk that was put up in Indianapolis, which gives you the same immersive stereoscopic effect, not quite as profound as a cave, but it's pretty darn good. And this was the very, very first facility of research and academic computing that was installed on the IUPUI campus. And these things were great hits. You know, if a picture is worth 1,000 words, then you know, a 3D visualization is worth a lot more than that. And in fact, when Mikhail Gorbachev visited Indiana University in 1997, he took a tour of the cave. Eric Werner and Eric's colleagues dolled up a 3D visualization of the solar system to include Mir. And I wasn't at that meeting, but reportedly former Premier Gorbachev looked at the visualization and said, ah, Mirsky. So this was the beginning of visualization and computing together being really, really important, both in supporting university research and making the university community aware of what we were doing. And then Vice President McRobbie worked with the Lilly Endowment to get what was the first of now many large grant awards from the Lilly Endowment to Indiana University for something called IPCRIS, the Indiana Pervasive Computing Research Initiative, $30 million, half of which went to fund up the new School of Informatics, half of which went to create the Pervasive Technology Labs. And this established the three-legged stool of research, development, and delivery that has been the foundation of our support for research, scholarship, and creative activity at IU ever since. Basic research in what is now the School of Informatics, Computing, and Engineering. Applied R&D, very often taking new innovations from SAIS and converting them into tools that are usable by everyday researchers in the Pervasive Technology Institute. And then services, systems, consulting, resources, computer storage systems, viz systems delivered by Research Technologies. And there are those three organizations. Presumably, many people know of one of the two recreational uses of nitrous oxide. There is a second, which is to make cars go really, really fast. This is the Go Baby Go button, which is commonly installed on the shifter of cars with a nitrous oxide system in them. And when you press that button, the car goes really fast. I happen to have my own Go Baby Go button. And so I'm going to rip through a whole bunch of accomplishments that research technologies and PTL and PTI have enabled at Indiana University. So hang on to your seats, here we go. 1999, we installed a tape robot in Bloomington with some very, very secure software called HPSS, designed to make sure that IU could preserve the data and materials being produced by the scholars and researchers and artists of Indiana University. We, in 2000, negotiated the first enterprise site license for SPSS for any university in the US. For many researchers at IU, the SPS site license is the most important thing that UITS ever did, because it made it possible for any researcher at Indiana University to have the social statistical package for the social sciences software. We got a major award from Lilly for something called InGen, the Indiana Genomics Initiative, $105 million. 6.7 million of that went into research technologies to improve our ability to support biomedical research, and a couple digital libraries things. So research technologies was very involved in the digital library project with the libraries, and on the left is an example from the US Steel Geary Works photo collection. Here is a picture from the Cushman photo collection. We also, in 2001, helped put online the alchemical notebooks of Isaac Newton, which really forced the physics community to reassess its own history. They proved conclusively that Isaac Newton, the great empirical scientist, the father of modern physics, spent most of the last years of his life diligently trying to turn lead into gold. When I was a physics student, when I was a student as an undergraduate in physics classes, I was told, yeah, you know, Newton messed around with that a little bit, but he wasn't really serious. You read his notebooks online, and it's clear that it was the major part of his thinking for the last years of his life. And I think that putting those notebooks online may be one of the most important things that Indiana University has done as a contribution to the study of the history of science. 2001 was a big year. We added another tape robot in Indianapolis, and research technologies created software such that people could write data simultaneously to tape robots in Indianapolis and Bloomington. So if a tornado destroyed Bloomington, or the earth opened up in a giant earthquake through the New Madrid Fault and swallowed Indianapolis, as long as those two events didn't happen on the same day, then the data resources stored by Indiana University and what we call the scholarly data archive would be preserved. This is one of many examples of UITS and research technologies taking advantage of the two-campus structure of Indiana University to mirror data storage and computing facilities between Bloomington and Indianapolis. We upgraded our IBM Sp Supercomputer to be the first supercomputer in the US owned by an individual university capable of more than 1 trillion mathematical operations per second. We received $1.8 million from the National Science Foundation to create something called AVID, Advanced Visualization for Instrument-Driven Data, which put viz and computing facilities at IU Northwest, IU PUI, and IU Bloomington, and really advanced the capabilities and computing services available for people that did data-intensive science. The NSF funded IU's participation in something called the TerraGrid, a national grid of supercomputers for use by the national research community. This was the first time that we were really beyond our own campus. This was the first time that we had federal money to serve the national research community. And Eric Werner, John Huffman the elder, the chemistry professor, and John Huffman the younger, the IT professional, created something called the Johnny Box, this 1 meter cube, which for a few $1,000s allowed anyone to have a stereoscopic visualization environment in their lab. One of many things that AVL has done to make high quality visualization accessible throughout the university. And here on the right, there's just an example, just a diagram, Bloomington, Indianapolis, IU Northwest. Systems redundant between both campuses, storage redundant between both campuses so that we could keep our systems up and running all the time and preserve IU's data reliably no matter what. From 2003 to 2005, there was a real shift and the national strategies for advanced computing. Before 2003, the National Science Foundation, Department of Energy, the other federal funding agencies thought of supercomputers as if they were time machines. The function of a supercomputer was to take a person doing a very, very important problem and take them into the future of computing capabilities and let them do something that would be generally possible for other researchers only years in the future. In 2003, the National Science Foundation coined this term called cyberinfrastructure. And the idea was that it was supposed to be more generally relevant to everybody. It was supposed to, a tide that lifted all boats, enhanced the capabilities of all sorts of researchers. And the NSF didn't actually define cyberinfrastructure. It was clear that if you wrote a proposal to the NSF, you had to use the word cyberinfrastructure. And the NSF always danced around it. They say things like, cyberinfrastructure isn't just. Cyberinfrastructure is more than. Cyberinfrastructure is not limited to. There was never a sentence that came out of the NSF that went, cyberinfrastructure is. So Steve Sims and I and several of our friends coined this definition of cyberinfrastructure. And it has become the standard definition. And I won't read the whole thing to you, but the gist of it is computing systems, data resources, people, software, networks, all tied together to improve research productivity and to enable things that would otherwise not be possible. And in this new environment of cyber infrastructure designed to be broadly useful to all sorts of researchers throughout the US, we really thrived. 2003, we received funding to be the informatics core for a collaborative initiative studying fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. In 2004, IU got another $53 million from the Lilly Endowment for something called Metasite, which was designed to improve biological research on the Bloomington campus. We received $4.5 million more from the NSF to be part of the TerraGrid. We received $1.7 million from the NSF to create something called the Data Capacitor. This was an episode in sleep deprivation. There was like 3 months in which we wrote just around $60 million worth of grant proposals. Every last one of them was funded. Boy, we were just stupid tired by the end, but we got some funding for some really great projects. The Data Capacitor in particular stands out, and Steve Sims was really the architect of this. We decided there were better ways to move data around than by strapping your data to burrows. The Data Capacitor was designed to be very large and very fast for collecting data and then dispersing it where you wanted to put it to have it be analyzed. Oh yeah, in 2005, on April Fool's Day, I was promoted to be Associate Dean for Research Technologies. And in 2006, we unveiled the Big Red Supercomputer, which debuted in 23rd place on the top 500 list. This is a list of the 500 fastest supercomputers in the world. It's the highest we've ever been on that list. It was just an amazing feat of computer design and implementation. And boy, that supercomputer was fast. We also, in Indianapolis, installed a Barco virtual reality theater, an immersive 3D stereoscopic environment like the cave, only better. 2007, we helped Jeffrey Fox get nearly $2 million to study Arctic and Antarctic ice sheets. 2008, we received a second round of funding to convert the Pervasive Technology Labs into the Pervasive Technology Institute. 2009, with a considerable amount of help from us, Jeffrey Fox received just over $10 million to create an experimental grid and computer system called Future Grid. 2010, we partnered with a private company called Wham Cloud to improve the software that runs the Data Capacitor then and now. 2011, notably, we received funding for the National Center for Genome Analysis Support. This was another big step for us in getting federal funding to support national research communities. So the National Center for Genome Analysis Support supports any researcher in the US doing non-classified research who needs help with genome assembly or transcriptome assembly. In 2011, we were funded to be a major partner in something called Exceed. It's a terrible name, I know, everybody knows. It's been a terrible name since its inception. It stands for the Extreme Science and Engineering Discovery Environment. It is the coordinating and support function funded by the National Science Foundation to support all of its supercomputers and cloud computers. And then in 2012, we got $3.2 million to operate something called the Open Science Grid. So the Open Science Grid is a very large grid of a lot of computers, particularly designed to analyze data from Large Hadron Collider at CERN. And 7 by 24 by 365, that system was kept up and running by people in Bloomington and Indianapolis. So at this point, Indiana University is a major player on the national scene in research computing. We're involved in Exceed, we're involved in the Open Science Grid, we're getting lots of federal money, we're doing lots of very, very cool stuff. But we weren't done. In 2013, we dedicated Big Red 2, the first 1 petaflops supercomputer owned by an individual university. That's 1,000 trillion mathematical operations per second. Also, the only supercomputer dedication that I can think of that was attended by an Oscar winner and a Grammy winner. That computer is with us today. It is the backbone of our supercomputing environment here at IU. In 2014, we received a grant from the National Science Foundation to create Jetstream, which was the first NSF-funded cloud system for general purpose research. So here we've gone beyond the first thing that some university can afford to beating the major national supercomputing centers to get NSF funding to run a cloud resource for the national research community. And we named it by analogy with the jet stream in the upper atmosphere, which is at the boundary of 2 large bodies of air up in the upper atmosphere. The idea behind Jetstream was that it was to sit at the boundary between the existing NSF-funded computing infrastructure and its users, and the rest of the research community that was not using NSF-funded systems because the needs of these people were not well met by the existing NSF supercomputers. And we succeeded. Something over 80% of the people who get accounts on Jetstream are getting their first account on an NSF-funded computing resource. We have more biologists using Jetstream than any of the other NSF-funded computers, and major use in other areas of science, geology and atmospheric science in particular. Yeah, and we just sort of, the hits kept on coming. That's been kind of a quick whirlwind. Here are the grants we got, here are the things we did. I want to talk a little bit about some of the persisting impact that we've had in research scholarship and creative activity. We've supported a bunch of cool research. There was an article just a few years ago by David Polly of IU and one of his colleagues at University of Nebraska-Lincoln that proved that everything we thought we knew about the evolution of limblessness in snakes was wrong. That research was done using our Quarry computer. We've made important contributions to the understanding of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. We have supported data analysis from one of the best Earth-based telescopes in existence. This M51 Galaxy picture here was taken with the 1-degree imager out at Kitt Peak in Arizona. Just a lot of really cool science. A lot of impact on the arts. Amongst fine artists, one of the first people in the US who had virtual reality as their primary means of artistic expression received tenure at IU. Margaret Dolinsky, who's one of our collaborators and partners, and is shown here on the left. Nicole Jacquard, sculptor, uses 3D printing in her art. Rob Shakespeare has been one of the big users of our supercomputers from the very inception. And here is a picture of the light totem, which is really one of the top items if you tour IU Bloomington. So we've supported some very, very cool artistic work. We have really, really impacted the university's access to visualization systems. So this right here is a prettied up Johnny box that is photographed in the Indianapolis Museum of Art, showing some of Margaret Dolinsky's art. This is a now retired visualization system that was up in Indianapolis that allowed you to look at very, very large, very detailed images. This picture here is of something called an IQ wall. It's part of a series of technology developed by the Advanced Virtualization Lab. There's an IQ tilt out in the atrium. This is being used in a lecture about a collection of photographs taken in South Africa in the 1950s. This picture doesn't do it justice. When you see the photographs of the conditions under which miners worked in South Africa in the 50s, blown up to 6 feet by 8 feet, there's just no good words to describe it. And that is made possible. That sort of impact of that photographic art is made possible by the Immersive Desk. This is an immersive visualization system that's right next door in the Innovation Center. This is me and Governor Daniels in the Barco VR Theater up in Indianapolis. We are looking at the results of a simulation of proton-neutron interactions on the surface of a neutron star. So really cool stuff in the visualization environment. This deserves more than one slide. This thing here is called the Science on a Sphere. It's right outside this lecture room. It's great for any sort of data that you have that you can project on a giant ping pong ball. Pictures of the surface of the Earth, ocean temperatures of the surface of the Earth, the world's entire history of the balls used in World Cup soccer championships. Cool stuff there. Also, Chauncey Friend has invented a very, very cool immersive VR environment called Pipes. You sit in it with VR goggles, and you get scent and temperature and airflow. So when you walk outside into a virtual reality garden, you smell the flowers, you feel the sun, and you feel the wind. It is a very, very intense immersive virtualization environment. That's Chauncey right there, and he does have a startup that's commercializing this technology. Performing arts, Werner Herzog was here a few years ago. Research Technologies Advanced Visualization Lab has been very, very involved in the IU Cinema. When Herzog was here, AVL created the digital cinema packages for all of the Herzog movies that were screened. That's essentially a digital compilation of everything you need to both show the movie and understand it. And those become persistent artifacts. Once you've done that, that's what everybody else uses. We have enabled an internet-required opera about global warming. Now, you may not have even known that there was an opera about global warming, but there is. It's called Oxalic. It was written by Scott Deal, percussionist of IUPUI and one of his collaborators. And the only way you can experience it is on the internet because it is explicitly designed to be performed by multiple groups of performers in multiple locations. And the only way to experience the whole thing is to throw a headset on and watch it on the web. So some really cool arts. Digital humanities. Research Technologies has gotten very, very involved in what's called photogrammetry, where you take lots of 2D pictures of 3D objects and then you create a 3D reconstruction. So here we have the mermaid from Showalter Fountain. We have here a 3D image of a pre-Columbian settlement and set of religious buildings in Mexico that was done with thousands of 2D photographs that were taken from a little drone and then stitched together. So you can fly through this in virtual reality in 3D, or you can print it out with a digital printer and see it as a big piece of starch as well. Digital humanities, I'm going to come back and talk a little bit more about this topic in a couple minutes, but this is an analysis of word use in Kurt Vonnegut's novel Cat's Cradle. I'm not a Vonnegut expert. I'm certainly not an expert on word analysis, but what this graph shows is the relative use of a set of key terms over the course of this novel that helps writing scholars and scholars of English understand what Vonnegut was doing with this book. And I'm going to ask the very quick question, how do you suppose it was that people got a hold of a copy of a copywritten book that they could then analyze with computers? I will answer that question for you in a few minutes. So I'm going to do a quick rewind here, and I want to talk just a little bit about the Pervasive Technology Institute in isolation of research technologies and the other things I've talked about. So PTI has sort of grown up. It's persisted from 1999 to today. It has a group of centers that have done some very, very important research, and like I said, importantly, have persisted. And very, very quick history, established in 1999, second round of funding in 2008. And in 2008 even, it was still sort of very inwardly focused. We got money from the Lilly Endowment. We're going to go spend that money. We're going to do good research. And then in 2017, there was a really significant organizational change. My job got split into two pieces. My old job running research technologies at that point went to Matt Link, which I'm very happy about. And I'm focused exclusively on the Pervasive Technology Institute. And I just want to run through the centers and say a little bit about what they do. The Center for Applied Cybersecurity Research, one of the oldest of the PTI centers and one of the most important. We live in a dangerous world. The world is filled with bad actors who want you to believe fake things on Facebook, may want to mess with our ability to do research by messing with people's research data, may want to hijack your accounts at your bank. CACR works with funding from a variety of government sources to help secure critical military infrastructure, scientific infrastructure, and our everyday computing infrastructure. So if you've ever listened to a moment of security on the radio, that is a CACR product. And they serve the nation in improving the security of our networked computing resources with a very strong focus on research computing resources. The Science Gateways Research Center. The Science Gateways Research Center creates technology that isn't at all obvious to see. But what it does is that it ties together multiple supercomputers, multiple data storage systems, visualization software, and it makes running a very, very complex engineering analysis, data analysis, or computer simulation seem very simple through a web portal because they're very, very sophisticated web portals. So people who are everyday, ordinary, practicing scientists can do chemical engineering and docking potential drugs against drug targets. We've got some very, very sophisticated educational gateways. And these things are created by the Science Gateway Research Center. The National Center for Genome Analysis Support has helped researchers all over the US assemble the genomes and transcriptomes of a bunch of organisms, ranging from things that are economically important. A lot of these, cows are economically important, diatoms, ocean invertebrates are very important, very cool tiger salamanders. This is just a sampling of the organisms whose genomes and transcriptomes have been assembled with help from the National Center for Genome Analysis Support. The Data to Insight Center, led by Beth Plaley, who's currently on leave at the National Science Foundation, is focused generally on turning data into insight. One of the things that's happening right now is that the HathiTrust Research Center is being carved out from the Data to Insight Center and is being created as its own center. The HathiTrust Research Center is related to the HathiTrust, the place that has copies of all of the Google books from the Google Books project, 16 million volumes of text in a variety of languages. 10 million of those 16 million volumes are protected by copyright. So I asked the question, how do you analyze one book that's in copyright? You can analyze one by buying a digital copy and having it scanned, and maybe you can do that with 10. But if you want to analyze word usage and look at, say, 1,000 or 1,000,000 or 5,000,000 books that are protected under copyright, and you don't want to be sued, it's a very hard thing to do. What the HathiTrust Research Center creates is something called the Data Capsule that is modeled after social science research centers where people analyze very, very sensitive data. So all that copywritten text is kept inside that data capsule. And when you want to analyze it, you send your query into the data capsule, and the HathiTrust Research Center computing tools do the analysis, and they send the results back out without sending out enough text to violate copyright rules. And this system is secure enough that it is approved by all of the lawyers at all of the big publishing companies that have text that are in it. So it makes possible humanities research that would be impossible without a way to electronically analyze and manage copywritten texts. The Digital Science Center is led by Jeffrey Fox, School of Informatics, Computing, and Engineering. They do work primarily in the area of developing software for big data. Collectively, RT and PTI have aided the economy of Indiana and the research, scholarship, and creative activity economics of IU. And I want to talk a little bit about money for a couple minutes here. We've been running this positive feedback loop where we go out, we get grant awards, we do good stuff, we hire smart staff, then we go write more grant proposals, we get more money, hire more smart people, do more good stuff. We've been running this positive feedback loop for decades. It has worked really well. Just as one indication of how important our computing resources are to the community, there are 134 different departments at Indiana University where some researcher in that department makes some use of our computational systems. So this pretty diagram here shows usage of Big Red 2 in calendar 2017. The size of the box corresponds to the amount of computing use a given department has made. So the biggest box is physics, and then there's chemistry, but there's biomedical research, there's geology, there's medical and molecular genetics in Indianapolis, there's interior design and apparel merchandising, history of science. All sorts of departments make use of our supercomputers. 134 departments, tremendous reach within the university community, much more than at our peer schools and peer computing organizations. We have a tremendous impact on the grant competitiveness of IU faculty members. So in 2017, IU researchers brought in a total of $508 million of external grants and contracts. If you ask, okay, of that $508 million, the people that brought in that money, do they use our cyber infrastructure systems or not? And the answer is that people that use our systems brought in $409 million of the $508 million total grant money brought into Indiana University. And then if you ask the money, by the way, if you ask the money question, is it cheaper to have our own stuff or to buy it off the market? We did a cost comparison where we pretended that Amazon Web Services was as good for supporting computing research as Big Red 2 is. By the way, it's not, for technical reasons that I won't go into, having to do with internal networks and this. But if you pretend that Amazon is as good for supporting IU research as Big Red 2 is, our own systems are still 2 to 3 times less expensive than buying resources off of Amazon. So we're helping IU competitively win federal grant monies, and we're doing it cost effectively. We've created hundreds of years of jobs in the central and south central Indiana area. So this graph here shows growth of IT staff in research technologies and PTI over time. This is base-funded staff in research technologies right here. This is grant-funded staff in research technologies. This is grants-funded staff in PTI. So dozens of people, hundreds of persons' years of employment at Indiana University in Indianapolis and Bloomington. And a lot of these people serve the national research community. And we're very careful that between 8 and 5, we serve the national research community equitably. But the people serving that national research community live in this community. So they run into researchers and students in the grocery store, in meetings, at lunch, at the Binford Rogers Spring Festival. I once did 2 hours of consulting at my granddaughter's spring festival at Binford Rogers because I ran into a professor at the spring festival who was there with his kid who was having a problem. And while his kid and my granddaughter were off winning cakes at the Binford Rogers Festival, we were spending 2 hours solving one of his problems. So the fact that these people supporting the national research community are here makes a difference to the quality of the IT resources and skills that IU researchers, staff, and students have accessible to them. We have done a lot to inspire the next generation of technologists. This is a picture of Robot Camp. Hundreds of students have gone through Robot Camp over well over a dozen years. They come in here. This is a picture taken in this room. They come in here, they spend a number of days learning how to program robots, and they go out inspired to pursue careers in technology. So it's a really great thing we've done for the future economy of Indiana. Along the way, we have supported research that has led to 3 Nobel Prizes, 2 in 2013. Through our involvement in the TerraGrid and Exceed, we supported the 2013 Nobel Prize in Chemistry. Through our involvement in the Open Science Grid, we supported the 2013 Nobel Prize in Physics, which was given out for the demonstration of the Higgs boson. And also through the Open Science Grid, we supported research in verifying the existence of gravitational waves that led to the 2017 Nobel Prize in Physics. This, by the way, is a picture from the Large Hadron Collider at CERN, and it's really big. To give a sense of how big, this is a big wire spool here. These are essentially, human-sized guardrails right there. And a lot of this work that led to Nobel Prizes was research that was done at the LHC and analyzed with computing systems that we run. So quick rewind to talk about national strategies in advanced computing. In the 1940s, the purpose of the fastest supercomputers in the US was really clear. They were defense instruments. This is ENIAC. This system was used to calculate artillery trajectories, and it was also used in one of the first feasibility studies of thermonuclear weapons. In the 1960s, our national priorities in science and technology were really clear. They were set by President Kennedy, put a man on the moon, and that was seen as a symbolic effort in the international campaign for the hearts and souls of people throughout the world in the battle between democracy and communism. In the 1980s, there was a lot of clarity in computing as well. This concept of the time machine, the Department of Energy supercomputers were the fastest in the world. Oh yeah, there are all sorts of industrial uses as well. Building a big bulldozer is expensive. And when a big bulldozer tips over, it's really bad. And this bulldozer is really big. That's a person-sized door right there. Caterpillar simulated this bulldozer at supercomputers of the National Center for Supercomputing Applications in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, and simulated it to the point that they were sure they knew how to build it before they ever built their first prototype. So lots of great things in the 80s. And also during the 80s, something that was just generally true was that new processors were built for supercomputers first and then filtered out into the consumer market. In the 1990s, we had the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and supercomputing was viewed as, again, a defense asset. The idea was that we would outcompute the Russians, and we would be able to maintain our nuclear deterrence more effectively than the Russians in the absence of testing, because we could simulate nuclear weapons and even build nuclear weapons without ever once testing them as a result of our superiority in supercomputing. That sort of began to change in the 2000s when, for the first time, somebody other than the US had the fastest supercomputer in the world. The Japanese Earth simulator was actually the #1 supercomputer in the world for about 2.5 years. And there was about 1 week of shock in Washington in which people said, oh my God, we have lost leadership in supercomputing. This is really bad. We need to do something about this. And after about a week, people realized that it was actually cheaper to say, you know, the Japanese supercomputer, it's really special purpose. It isn't generally useful. We shouldn't worry about it. The fact that it's #1 on the top 500 list is an anomaly. We're still #1. There's even less clarity now. We had this National Strategic Computing Initiative signed by President Obama in 2015, which was designed to put the US back in a position of global leadership in supercomputing. But in fact, we're not. We're distinctly second behind China. China has and has had the fastest supercomputer on Earth, at least that we know about. In terms of the top 500 list, if you look at the top 10 fastest supercomputers on that list, China has a larger fraction of the total capacity in the top 10 than the US has. If you look at the capacity of the top 500 list, China has larger capacity total of its supercomputers combined than the US has. And China has more supercomputers on the top 500 list than the US has. And China is going to beat the US to an exaflops. That's 1,000 petaflops, or 1,000 trillion mathematical operations per second. China's going to beat the US to having an exaflop supercomputer probably by 2 years. The DOE announcements recently notwithstanding. Unless there's something that wasn't declared publicly as part of the DOE strategies, the DOE strategies that are announced at least will in fact not put the US back in a position of international leadership in supercomputing. It will just keep US #2 behind China. So we have really lost what we thought of as being a key US strategic asset that we held on to for decades. And a lot of other things changed. In processor development, it's now the commodity market that is dog and supercomputers that are tail. So rather than having processors built for supercomputers and bleed out into the consumer market, we have processors that are built for the consumer market and then adapted to supercomputing. The long-standing trend of processors getting smaller, faster, and cheaper is coming to an end. After years of pressure from the NSF in particular for computer facilities and computer-intensive research to be more generally useful, there's a lot of pressure now to very quickly say what you're going to do and how long and what the practical benefit is going to be, and there's less federal funding. And it's worse than that. State funding for universities and colleges is going down. In the next few years, hundreds of institutions of higher education are going to go bankrupt, small colleges and university. We're facing worse and very different security threats than we ever have before. The one thing that hasn't changed is there's still no money from the federal government for arts and humanities. And so we've got some real challenges moving forward at the university level and at the national level. In terms of IU-funded resources, one of the things we have to do is just continually demonstrate the value of what we do to the university. We have to demonstrate the financial soundness of our strategies, and we are working very, very hard to broaden the scope of utility of the facilities that we provide to the university. In terms of federal funding, we've just got to work hard and adapt. There's less federal money, and getting grants is harder, and we just have to work really, really hard. And we've got work in society to do as well, because there are very difficult things happening at the national level, and they're not going to get better without smart people being engaged and involved in those conversations. I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that we're doing specifically along the lines of what I just described. Research Technologies, Matt Link, Robert Henschel, Dave Hancock, and their colleagues are developing this thing called RED, the Research Desktop, which is designed to make it even easier than it already is to use IU supercomputers. So you get something that looks like a standard graphical user interface you might see on a laptop or a desktop computer, only it's running IU supercomputers and massive data storage systems. We are at the other end supporting IU's grand challenges with a new supercomputer called Big Red 2 Plus, which is dedicated to IU's grand challenges in precision health, preparing for global change, and battling the addictions crisis, as well as being used to address US grand challenges in exascale computing, particularly working with faculty members in the School of Informatics, Computing, and Engineering to build software that will enable the US to be back in a leadership position in exascale computing. Federal research funding exists to help the nation support doing good things. In 1945, when there was a debate going about the creation of the National Science Foundation, James Bryan Conant, who was at that point the president of Harvard University, wrote a letter to the editor of the New York Times. It was really a promotional piece lobbying for the creation of the National Science Foundation. And I have taken the liberty of updating his language. He wrote, "There's only one proven method of assisting the advancement of pure science, that of picking people of genius, backing them heavily, and leaving them to direct themselves. The Research Technologies Division of UITS backs the people of genius in the IU community, backs them strongly, and trusts them to be doing great and important work." Conant also said there's only one proved method of getting results in applied science, and that is to take people of genius, back them strongly, and keep them on target. That's really what the Pervasive Technology Institute does. We are a group of centers that do things that the federal government wants done, and we do them the way the federal government wants them done. And Conant didn't say a darn thing about humanities and the arts, but Research Technologies and PTI both support humanities and the arts as an important part of what this university does. And I already said that. So the stuff on this slide I've said. I want to talk a little bit about Indiana University and grant getting. Indiana University brings in a fair amount of grants. It underperforms on large grants as compared to many of its peers. One $10 million grant award is worth more than 10 $1 million grant awards in terms of its impact. Because at $10 million, you've got multiple faculty members working together. You're working on a really big and important problem. You're doing a lot of dissemination. You're telling a lot of people about what you're doing. And you know, IU's performance in the 10 million and up category is an issue. In the past 15 years, there have been a dozen of these national core awards that tend to be very large to the School of Medicine in Indianapolis, where they're doing some sort of service on behalf of the national research community. We've got one in Bloomington, the National Center for Genome Analysis Support. We don't have any of the large NSF Center grants, the so-called Science and Technology Center grants. If you look in the last 15 years for awards that were greater than $10 million, there's 21 of them to the School of Medicine. There's 2 to PTI. There's 1 other to OVPIT, and 3 others to Bloomington. There are a few more large ones if you add up sequences, like our involvement in Teragrid and OSG. But when it comes right down to it, the place that Indiana University underperforms in getting large grants is IU Bloomington. And I think one of the real challenges is that responsibility center management creates barriers to creating the very, very large collaborations that make these large grants possible. Where we are right now is the Grand Challenges program is IU's best and most important attempt to facilitate very large-scale collaborations, and PTI and RT are working very, very hard to support the Grand Challenges. And PTI in particular is just doubling down on getting grant funding to do things that are both important at the national level and consistent with IU's mission. So we go after things that are consistent with IU values and important to the federal government. And we're also working right now to look for non-federal funding sources. We have historically done really well at keeping staff members employed, keeping people going year after year after year after year on grant money. And we've slipped. I've used this picture for many, many years now. This is a picture from a dude ranch in upstate New York with one guy doing what's called Roman riding. He's got one foot on each of two horses. And I like to think about our funding support as having, being comprised of two horses, the horse of IU funding and the horse of federal funding. And the temptation is to focus on the horse of federal funding because that's the one that feels like it's going to fall out from underneath you. But what we believe is if we lost all of our federal funding and all we had was our IU funding, it would hurt like the dickens. Lots of people would lose their job. Important stuff would go undone. But you would still be able to recognize the organization that we are. On the other hand, if we lost the support of the university, what would be left would not be recognizable and would not be a service to IU. So we try to pay really close attention to both horses. And for the first time ever, the horse of federal funding has stumbled. We have had a group that lost its funding. And we lost funding for this group of about 5 people, not because we wrote a bad proposal, not because we did a bad job. We lost funding for this group of people because the government shutdowns that have plagued Washington in the last year made it impossible for the federal funding agencies to put out the grant solicitations to which we plan to respond and keep this group funded. So through no overt action, the simple interruption of government functions has wiped out a group of research support professionals at Indiana University who will find other jobs. But once that group is gone, there's no putting it back together again. And this is just one example of how precarious we are in terms of our national dialogue and scientific research in the US. And that national dialogue isn't going to get better without our participation. It's clear to me that many of the ideals behind the computer revolution, the internet, the World Wide Web, a lot of the ideals under which these things were created have now been subverted. On the internet, nobody knows you a dog used to be really funny. On the internet, nobody knows that you are a professional Russian troll is a very, very dangerous thing. And I saw a poster that said, misled people make misled decisions that benefit the misleaders, not the misled. And divisiveness pays. I would argue that Breitbart News and HuffPost have essentially identical business models. What Breitbart and HuffPost both do is they scream to Group A about Group B. The only difference between HuffPost and Breitbart is which group is Group A and which group is Group B. And as people who think and believe in the value of truth, these discussions that are going on at a national level aren't going to get better unless we're willing to participate in them. And I think as computer people, there's a particular obligation on us as well to think about what the computer revolution has done for the economy of the US. There are countries, and Germany is one of them, that have chosen high tech and high quality employment. That doesn't seem to be the choice that the US has made. What's our role in that? We need to be part of these national discussions because they aren't going to go well without us. I want to say just a very few things that I learned from Chris Peebles about living in challenging times. Trust in the excellence of the faculty of Indiana University. They really are excellent. Some of them are a bit goofy. Some of them are a bit difficult. On average, they're excellent. By serving them, we serve some of the best intellects in the world. Be human, and to be human is to be kind. And don't take it all very seriously. Chris used to say, I am sometimes thrown to the faculty as one might throw poisoned meat to wolves. They chew on me a while, eventually find me distasteful, and throw me back. And Chris was a great leader who believed in the value of the university and didn't take it too seriously. I want to say one comment about my path forward and that of research technologies. So last fall, I gave up 2 pieces of my old job. Matt Link became the Associate Vice President for Research Technologies. Dave Hancock became the Principal Investigator of Jetstream. And I am now focused on PTI. it is with utmost confidence that I look at Dave and Matt as leaders of Jetstream and research technologies generally. And I've got my work cut out for me for the next few years. There are tremendous challenges ahead of us. One of the challenges that is given to us by President McRobbie is to help Indiana University become one of the great universities of this century. And I believe that we are up to this task, and that the things that we do in research technologies, PTI, and University Information Technology services generally will help IU become one of the great universities of this century. And there you have it. We have changed the world some already. We just need to keep doing it, and we need to do it more. With that, I want to thank a bunch of people. The Lilly Endowment, boy, if you want to look at one organization that got us from where we were in 1996 to where we are today, the repeated injections of thoughtful support from the Lilly Endowment have been absolutely critical. We've done a lot of research with a lot of support from a bunch of federal funding agencies. All opinions presented here are those of the speaker and may not necessarily reflect the opinions of any federal funding agencies, and certainly some things I have said would be disavowed by essentially any federal funding agency, I am sure. And I want to thank a bunch of people. I want to thank my family, my wife Marion, Kai, George, Madeline, Tony, Kristen, and Elam, and Marla. Where's Marla? Yeah. So thank you all very much. I want to thank all of my colleagues. One of the things that I've always said is that I never mistake the leader for the team. When I was the leader of research technologies, I was just the leader. It's the team that matters. And I want to thank everybody in our team, PTI past and present, but especially the sort of the brain trust. Eric Werner, Therese Miller, Steve Sims, Matt Link, Dave Hancock, Robert Henschel, Von Welch, Marlon Pierce, Mike Boyles, who did a lot of the work behind a lot of the biz systems that we've talked about. Early leaders, Mary Popopkin and Melinda Husk. I want to thank Winona Snap-Childs, who edits me better than any other editor ever has. The people in OVPIT who supported me, particularly in the last 14 months as I have been overcoming cancer. The largest care package I got was from the finance office.
Telling.
You know, the finance office? Now, I will say that they got advice from Matt Allen, so they got good advice. But finance office, Richard Mraz has been a great help to me in this time as well. Radina Honeycutt. Where's Radina? Radina, stand up. Radina has ruled my days from 8 to 5, and when I have traveled for just about 13 years, we have come to the conclusion that no human being deserves to have to be Matt Link's boss and my boss. So Matt gets to keep Radina, and I don't, and I thank Radina for many years. I want to thank the faculty, staff, and students of IU. A services organization is worthless without people to serve. The IU community gives us great people to serve. And I want to end by thanking my mentors, particularly Chris Peebles, Brad Wheeler, and Michael McRobbie. And with that, are there any questions? Thank you all very much.
The talk because it reminded me of when I joined up, which was around the AVID time. Remember this? And I don't know if it came through for everybody else, but it sure came through for me. It was a lot of fun, man.
Oh,
we had some fun. So
we have done some awesome and fun work, and we've invented a bunch of stuff. It's been really cool. And one thing I should say, so Scott was involved in building one piece of the Large Hadron Collider. So the senior-most person involved in the Large Hadron Collider within the US was Harold Ogren, physics professor at Indiana University. And one part of one of the two experiments that constitutes the major reason for the existence of the Large Hadron Collider was constructed on 3rd Street in Swain Hall. So our involvement in the Open Science Grid and the Large Hadron Collider from the computing standpoint very definitely drafts the leadership and excellence of the physics community here at IU. And it has been a lot of fun. And it will continue to be fun because I am not done yet. So, other questions? With that, let me thank you all for your attention. This will be the last time ever that I give a talk like this, because from now on, talking about the history of RT is Matt's job and other people's and research technologies' job. So thank you all very much for your attention, and have a great day.